Fantastic. Well, it's Thanksgiving, of course. So for people like me, I think, and for many of us here, conjures up warm feelings of family time, maybe hot cocoa, pumpkin pie. For me, it's not pumpkin pie. I really couldn't care less, but chocolate pie maybe or something like that. Whatever your favorite Thanksgiving treat is. For others, though, I'm well aware, it conjures up maybe feelings of like cold sweat terror of bad family gatherings, tension, arguments, standoffs between other family members, or equally, loneliness or a sense of distance. I went to university for a couple of years, and of course every Thanksgiving or Christmas, there's a lot of students who have moved away from home, far away, sometimes halfway around the world, and it becomes a very lonely time then too. But as we talk about families, and I started this series a couple of weeks ago talking about families, I talked about conflict, I talked about tension, I talked about the messiness of family, and nobody seemed surprised I would launch a series on family by talking about conflict. Not one person came up to me and asked, why did you do that? Because I think we all understand that when you love people or are close to them, whether it's physically or emotionally close to them, it almost inevitably breeds kind of conflict and tension. What's up with that? How is that? Why do we have such tension with our family? You know, you can pick your friends, but you can't pick your family. You were born into your family, but I bet you, growing up, somewhere around junior high, senior high, whatever it was, you would have picked your friend's family. Somebody else. Somebody who wasn't your own family. For me, I had one friend who had never had to do any chores, and there was an endless supply of nacho chips and bagel bites all the time. And in grade 7, that was my standard for the perfect family. No work and nacho chips. That was it. But what happens to all of us, thankfully I stayed with my family and I got, raised up well and all that, but what happens is, as you hit maybe, junior high, senior high, it depends kind of who you are, what your natural character is, where it comes, but at some point in time, you become convinced, explicitly or implicitly, that nobody in your family is as smart as you are. Nobody in your family could possibly be as smart as you are. Because what's happened is you're beginning to catch and understand and process these underlying principles to kind of grease the wheels of social interactions and family behavior. Things like forgiveness, don't yell at the other person needlessly, apologize quickly, this sort of the unconditional love and trust. And you sort of, I think many people I've talked to, myself included, at some point in time figured, why don't these other people just get that? Why don't they just understand that? And we feel like if we were given the reins of the family, you could solve all the problems in about 20 minutes. You forgive that person, you stop yelling, you drink less, you maybe, whatever. And you just solve it all, and everything would just be done in like 20 minutes. And then you grow up. And you get married. Maybe you have a kid or two. And all of a sudden, like a flip switch, it just reverses on you. And suddenly you're reeling. And you're trying to apply these principles, these perfect ideals. And it's like a freight train hits a semi-truck and it just explodes. And everything's just wrong. And you feel like you have no answers. So what's the deal? At some point in time, you feel like you have all the answers. And then you feel like you have no answers. And you're wrestling with this and you're reeling. And these family situations become real. And you're actually the one who's supposed to be making the decisions. You're finally the one with your hands on the reins, and it's not as easy as it seemed. I mean, it seemed really easy when you were in junior high. You could just kind of point and talk. But you need to get the reins of the family, or of a decision, or of a company, or of a friendship, and it's not so easy. Now it's getting really hard. The ideals were great. Nothing wrong with those ideals. They're often true and godly. Maybe a few of them are misguided. They're great, but for some reason they don't seem to work. Ever notice that? So we have this tension between these ideals and the real. Between the real, muddy, messy life and these ideals we have. And it doesn't matter how hard you try to shake them. Like, those were unrealistic, I shouldn't have expected that out of people in the first place. But you can't quite shake it. There's a seed of the idea that unconditional love and forgiveness and explicit trust should be real. But they're not. They stay in the realm of the ideal, and real life just drags them down. The ideal's impossible to shake, but the real's impossible to ignore. I was at a tractor pull once when I was younger. And there was this one tractor. This is a mean-looking tractor. I mean, it wasn't even a tractor anymore. It was all chopped and spliced and whatever the case. And there was, I think, 6, maybe more than 6, big block engines on the front of this thing, all kind of ponied up together. I don't know, a few thousand horsepower through that drivetrain. And you don't pull tractors against each other. There's a sled, kind of a sled unit, and there's a counterweight that slides as you drive, so it gets harder and harder and harder and harder until wherever your tractor stops. And then, of course, the further you go, the better your chances are of winning. And so this thing was just massive. And, fire shooting out of the exhaust pipes and all impressive. And this guy starts going, and he is just off like a shot. But I don't know what happened. Maybe he twitched or flinched or something. He was going well, and you could just see he let off the accelerator a little bit. Just a pause somewhere on there. And what happens is when you let off the accelerator, that sled, that weight comes forward, and everything just kind of jammed up and bit. But he was still moving slowly, just slowly. What he did is he didn't want to lose, because I'm pretty sure he might have had the best rig or like top 3 of the rigs there. And so he just hammered down. But now he's lost his momentum forward. And this thing was slowing, and that engine was pulling louder and louder and louder. And I bet you can guess what happened next. Because at least one, it was hard to count, of those big block engines just exploded. Shrapnel went everywhere. The top of the engine block flew off. There was fire, and of course that's what you come to see when you go to a tractor pull. These things explode and whatever else. And this guy just looked wrecked, because that's a lot of money. That's how I feel sometimes, and I think some of us feel, when we have these grand ideas and great ideals with us, and then there's this real life and our baggage and other people, maybe, that are just like hitched to us. And you wanna live in this perfect world, and you're stuck tied to this imperfect world, and the tension grows and grows and grows. Now Jesus was a master communicator, master teacher, and I would like to put forward, lived a perfect life. So I'd expect him to have dealt with this even more than I have. And here's what I'd expect. I'd expect him to somehow relieve or bridge that tension in some perfect way. Somehow maybe help us understand what the ideals are supposed to be in a more manageable way, maybe. Or maybe help us unhook in some way from that weight and that real world messy stuff. We're going to look at what he says here. We're going to be in Matthew for most of the time, so you can watch the screen. Or if you have a Bible, you can turn to Matthew 5. We'll kind of be walking through some of that. But he's addressing a bunch of his followers in a big crowd. And I just want to take apart a little bit what he says here. He says, you've heard it said to our ancestors, do not murder, right? Don't kill another human being. This makes pretty good sense. And whoever murders will be subject to judgment. That seems fair. But I tell you, everyone who is angry with his brother will be subject to judgment. And whoever says to his brother, fool, will be subject to the Sanhedrin, which was the courts of the time. Well, that's steep. You think that's steep, though? Look at this next sentence. But whoever says, you moron, will be subject to hellfire. Let's preach on that for a while. If you call somebody a moron, you're going to hell. Like, that's steep. I mean, I felt tension before, and now look what Jesus is doing here. He's raising the tension. It's like the tractor's pulling, and he just slapped more horsepower on the front, but I'm still tied down to that weight in the back. What's happening here? I mean, have you ever been to a family gathering with tension and arguments and yelling and vindictiveness and old kind of things being dredged up, and you went home, maybe you lost your temper, maybe you didn't, but you went home thinking, I'm a saint. I must be a pretty decent guy because at least I didn't kill anybody. You ever felt that way? Have you ever been in a situation like that, maybe with your boss or a coworker? We felt, I didn't kill anybody, so I must be doing all right. But here Jesus is saying, just thinking of them as morons is as good as having killed them. My thoughts and feelings are now under the same kind of rule as my actions. It's hard enough controlling my actions sometimes. Like, this is getting tense. A few verses later, he said, you've heard it said, do not commit adultery. Don't join your body with another person outside of marriage here. But I tell you, everyone who looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery in his heart. So in that one verse, Jesus made every single man sitting here today an adulterer. And probably most of the women, but I'll speak for the men here. Right there. Right there. An adulterer. Well, This is terrible. Now we're under a greater burden with more horsepower, and the tension's just rising. And probably my favorite verse, he ends this whole thing off with, be perfect, therefore, as your Father in heaven is perfect. Well, that's just great. Now I'm completely hooped. Be perfect. That's the standard. I was feeling the tension before of the ideal and the real, and Jesus said, your ideal, it's garbage. Here's your ideal, way up here. What are we supposed to do now? Are we completely trapped? How are we supposed to navigate this? Look, I know a lot of people who have faced this tension before. Especially, just after maybe they graduate from school and they start having to navigate kind of the full realm of real life and working world. They feel this tension. Up until then, through your youth groups and whatever else, you can kind of be isolated in high school. You can kind of be isolated from the real world. You kind of hit that 18, 19, 20, 21, whatever it is, and you feel that tension and you make a choice. And for some of you, the burden of carrying that ideal in an imperfect and messy world that never lets you fully live out the ideal is just too much, and you withdraw. Just withdraw. You try to live a squeaky clean life. What happens is you'll find a squeaky clean church filled with other squeaky clean Christians who went to a nice squeaky clean Bible college somewhere and try to live your squeaky clean life. And they talk, and they talk, and they talk, and they argue, and they debate, but they dare not act. Because as soon as you act, it's going to get messy. And you're going to get the mud of the world on you, and it's too much. And you just withdraw, and you withdraw, and you withdraw. But you hold on to that ideal, and that's pretty good. And I know plenty of other people who just try to normalize their experiences. They experience so much mess and trouble and sadness and sickness that they just try to normalize it, and they compromise the gospel. They compromise Jesus' word, and they make a consistent gospel that's consistent with their life, devoid of any power, and they accept it. And their life looks like the rest of the world's lives. And they just kind of say things like, well, in this world we will have trouble. It's in the Bible somewhere, I'm sure. And it's all good. And they just try to work around the edges, maybe, fix a few things. Just try to live a decent life, and they coast and they compromise. Are those our options? Is that it? Is it withdraw from the world or compromise our ideals and just accept real life? Is that it? The Pharisees had this same question, I think, because they were masters of the law. They had read the Bible far better than any of us here have read the Bible, and they saw this contradiction back and forth on all sorts of issues. And I must get people come talk to me at least once a week and say things like stuff about money, or about how far they can go before marriage, or on divorce, or on whatever. And they see in the Bible these things that seem to be back and forth and reversed and flipped. And what it is it's this question about the tension between the ideal and the real. And so the Pharisees come, but they're not coming with questions. They're coming to test Jesus. They want to catch him. They want him to make a choice between the ideal and the real, and then they want to pounce on him one way or the other. Find a Bible verse that says the opposite of what he says or something, and hold him out for a liar. So what happens, Matthew 19, some Pharisees approach Jesus to test him, and they ask, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife on any grounds? See, there's some stuff in the Bible that speaks against divorce, but there's also some stuff in the Bible about rules for divorce. Seems to make some allowances. So they want to trap him in this, see if he can navigate this. So Jesus says, haven't you read, and this is just an insult. These are the most widely read biblical scholars of his day. Haven't you read? He says to them. So he's got no problem poking the beast a little bit. That he who created them in the beginning. He says, you're stuck in the messiness of real life right now. Guys, you're lost and muddled in the confusion of the real life. But look, in the beginning, made them male and female. And he also said, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, man must not separate. And see, now they're confused. Now they're really confused because they want to trap him. Now what Jesus is saying is kind of cutting right through their argument. And so I think they drop the test and the pretense. And now this is, I think, this is my opinion, an honest question. Why then, they ask him, did Moses command us to give divorce papers and send her away? So if in the beginning that's not what God wanted, why did God, through Moses, give some rules and some structure here to this whole thing and kind of speak into the issue? Jesus told them, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because of the hardness of your hearts. Permitted. But it was not like that way from the beginning. Look, the real world is messy, and we need to be living in the real world, but it was not that way from the beginning. There's still an ideal and a standard and God's original intent, and I know there's this tension. But you see that right here, Jesus refuses to condemn the sinners, but he refuses to excuse the sin. God has a plan and a purpose, an ideal, which Jesus will not tolerate being compromised. But yet there's a real world and a tension and a muddiness and a messiness in the real world that Jesus refuses to pull out of. And in that, there's this tension. And Jesus seems totally comfortable in this. He doesn't seem thrown off by this at all. I think we are supposed to hold ourselves and each other to the impossibly high, and I will admit, impossibly high standard of in the beginning. How was it in the beginning? What was God's original intention and design? But yet we are also supposed to be quick to forgive and quick with encouragement when we inevitably fail the impossibly high standard. When that tension grows, when you blow that engine, that we're quick to forgive and quick to come alongside. See, Jesus lived waist deep in that filth. God wasn't worried about us carrying his perfect ideal, his perfect law, and his perfect standard into the mud. He wasn't concerned about it getting dirty. He wasn't trying to keep it squeaky clean. A religion filled with ideas that are afraid to get dirty, that are so fragile, the messiness of the world might get it dirty, is not a religion worth following. But a religion that kind of works around the edges while you basically look and live and act and breathe just like everybody else is not a religion that has any power in this world. No light. Look, divorce is sin, porn is adultery, gossip is murder. That's there. It's unavoidable. It's an ideal that under the burdens of this culture we find impossibly hard to live up to. But Jesus balances that with, in Matthew 9, when he says, those who are well don't need a doctor, but the sick do. The sick do. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. For I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners. Look, Jesus actually came for the dirtiness, the messiness, the harshness, the tension. It was the point of his message. His message wasn't to bring some ideal and then call you up into this ideal. His message was to bring his ideal down into the mud on purpose. The word Christian really means Christ-like. To be Christ-like means to get dirty, to bring God's message down into the mud and to wrestle in that tension and to work with dirtiness. It's the actual point. I have a friend, and he's a good guy. He is a good guy. And he loves his city and his neighborhood. And he lives in a very rough part of Winnipeg, and he pours his heart out, and he loves his neighbors. But the burden of that and the work of that over the years and the hurting people around him, I think was in some ways too much for him, for his ideal standards. And he's compromised much of what I would call fundamental to godly living. In order for him to love his neighbor as himself, in the end, he had to become like his neighbor himself. And everything about his gospel, his mission, his word, his works, I feel is compromised because there's no power in living a life that looks like the lives you're trying to help. If that's the gospel of God living out, there's no power if your standard of living and the ideals you hold yourself to are the same as everybody else's. But I know lots of people, myself included, wrestle with this, that as we read and learn, the temptation is to pull back, to become a self-righteous prude, honestly. Studying the Bible and learning more and more and more and more. But the people in real life, messy real life, they'll smell that self-righteousness on you, and they don't like you. So that's something. Jesus had this ultra-high standard. He kept raising the standard. He said things like what I just said today in quoting from Jesus, and he said these really confrontational, harsh, perfect standard sort of words, and yet people who were nothing like Jesus liked Jesus. They were drawn to him. They were attracted to him because he didn't compromise the gospel, but he also didn't withdraw. He had no problem living with people who lived a compromised life. He was comfortable with that in that mud and in that mess. Is the choice that we're stuck with knowledge without love and love without integrity? Is that our choice? Or is there a third option? See, we tend to focus on the Bible as a bunch of good teaching, and it is. It is good teaching. What we tend to forget is that the Bible is actually also a document, a historical record of a life that actually lived, that actually practiced these things. That Jesus was a real man who really lived and really wrestled in a really muddy world. And it's not just good teaching or ideal. The Bible is a record of ideals dragged down into the mud, dragged through the mud in an untidy, messy lifestyle practiced out. And if we're reading and studying and thinking in some Bible study somewhere withdrawn from the world, we're missing the gospel, because the gospel was never meant to be read in a vacuum. It was never meant to be read in a vacuum. It was always meant to be read and understood in the context of living it out in our day-to-day lives, surrounded by day-to-day, regular, messy people. And there's tension in that. There's tension because it's easy to call on an ideal and to call out sin. It's also easy to go out and serve the world. Lots of people do it all the time, Christian, non-Christian, whatever. It's easy to serve the world. It is very, very difficult. And if you're planning on holding to an ideal while serving in this messy world, be prepared to have your heart broken. Be prepared to have your back broken. Be prepared for it to require everything of you and more, because it is so difficult to balance God's perfect ideal with serving and living and being the hands and feet in this messy world. But that's our challenge. That's the model Jesus gave. Those are the footsteps he walked, the footsteps we're called to walk in. Jesus said the greatest commandment was love the Lord your God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. Why would he pair those two? Why would he pair those two? Because loving God doesn't allow you to compromise on his ideals, on his perfect law, on his perfect word. It always references you to the whole of the Bible. In fact, it says in John, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. So loving God keeps the whole of the commandments in your heart as the ultimate ideal, and it won't let you compromise or back down or normalize your experience or say that what you've been through is okay. It keeps you focused always on that perfect ideal. But loving your neighbor as yourself always keeps you referencing the next person. In fact, earlier on in John, it says, by this all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. They won't know you're my disciples because you're trying to keep my perfect law, because you're trying to keep yourself clean, because you read the Bible a whole lot and you can quote a lot of things and you're living a squeaky clean life. They'll know you're my disciples if you love one another. Love God, love your neighbor. That right there is why the whole of the law and the prophets hangs on that one command, because the one command keeps you referencing all of God's law, and the other command keeps you in the world showing that love, being the hands and feet of Christ. This is hard. I know this is hard. But what if we as a church decided we were up for the challenge? What would that look like? What would that look like if we as a church, as one body, as one people, as one group decided we were not going to suffer a halfway gospel? What would that look like? How do we do that? What happens if we would say that we believe in real power and real strength and real honesty for a real ideal for a really, really broken and hurting world? And what if we believe for real, actually, that we could take that standard and we could show and help and demonstrate and work with a broken world and actually be the words of God in this world? And what if at the same time we refuse to compromise that gospel and we actually serve them as the hands and feet? What if we as a church decided to be both the word and the works of God in a hurting world? I've had this conversation with some people, and I've heard it's usually made a little bit more flowery, but essentially the argument is I'm not comfortable with one or the other. It's too hard. I'm not comfortable with it. And honestly, I don't think we have a choice. When I read the Bible and I look at our culture, I don't think we have a choice. I think that choice has been taken away from us long ago, because I believe decades ago already, The world rejected a church that is a Bible-thumping, theologically correct, but spiritually dead version of God. They've rejected it. They have said, I see no love in a harsh, cold gospel that is technically correct, but completely dead in the world. And they've rejected it. And the world, I believe, looking at our culture around us, is currently rejecting the watered-down, baby pablum, Christianity light, compromised gospel, where you look exactly like the culture so long as you've got a Jesus fish slapped on the bumper. Where there's no difference between you and the culture. Because there's no power in that. They look at that and they say, well, if that's Christianity, why am I going to church and going to a small group and serving and donating money and all that? And everything's going to be exactly the same as it was before. And they've rejected it. And I don't blame them, because if those were the two choices, no wonder they're choosing darkness over light. We live in a time, in a place, in a culture where more than ever now, people are rejecting the church. But more than ever now, people are interested in the person of Jesus. Not the Bible words written about Jesus, the person of Jesus. And I can't possibly explain the gap or the distance between the Bible words written about Jesus and the person of Jesus. And because if Jesus is a living, real person who held to that ideal but lived in the world, in the messiness, people are drawn to that. One quote, one fancy quote in isolation sounds like Bible-thumping condemnation to so many people in the world. But if they actually understand and believe and see that Jesus was a living person who came and practiced this, they're attracted to somebody who had high standards but wasn't afraid to get dirty. That's attractional to people. They're interested in that. We have no choice if we want to be effective kingdom builders in this world, but to live that out. And that's hard. I'm not denying that's hard. The culture we're walking into, the culture we're learning into, the culture we're growing into is against the church on average. We live in a post-church culture, and that's just the way it is. Whether you like it, hate it, whatever, doesn't matter. It's just simply a fact. That's where we live. The gospel we're carrying is going into a post-church culture that has rejected the church for mostly the two reasons I just mentioned. Bible-thumping coldness devoid of love, and watered-down Christianity light devoid of power. And they've rejected it. But we can, and we must bring the person, the real person of Jesus into this world. And that's going to be tension. It's going to be wrestling. It's going to be hard. That's why I have a challenge for you this week. When you came in, you all got a paper, I hope. If you didn't, there's some more at the Welcome Center. It's a small paper. This is not quite technically, for those of you who have measuring tapes, this is not quite technically 3x5. It is almost 3x5. I just couldn't buy 3x5 cards in enough quantity, and I couldn't fit 3x5 perfectly on a paper. So it's like 2 3/4 by 4 5/8. But I have a 3x5 challenge for you. And this is actually really simple. This is not everything. This isn't like if you do this, and this is all you do, then magically everybody will be saved and it'll be the kingdom of heaven here. This is a wonderful tool to help you guide your thinking process, your working process, your living process, so that you're not going to be falling down one track or the other track, but straight through where Jesus went, right in that tension where Jesus lived. So here it is. It's 3 5-minute challenges. This is 15 minutes. You can do this on your coffee break at work. You can do this, like, you just anywhere. Carry this with you in your pocket, in your wallet, your purse, whatever, and here it is with you. It's simple. It says right there, 5 minutes of prayer, the will of God. 5 minutes of Bible reading, that's the word of God. And 5 minutes of living it out in some way, that's the work of God. Now, here's my suggestion with that living it out. I would do this in this order. Pray before you come to the Bible. Referencing the Bible before you do the work, and doing the work in reference to the other two. It's a nice system. It's a closed loop, so that you're guided properly. And when you live it out, I would ask this question. What out of what I just read in 5 minutes, the last 5 minutes, has jumped out at me? Or who? Some action in there that I saw that jumped out at me? or some name or person who has come to my mind that I'm working with? Is there some way I can marry those two? If I can bring that together? Simple question. 15 minutes. If you actually do this every day, I guarantee this will change your life. 5 minutes of prayer, 5 minutes of Bible reading, 5 minutes living it out. See, what I was talking about, and I will not deny it, is difficult, it's complicated, it's filled with tension, it's filled with messiness. I don't deny that. But this is simple. And I think this right now will bring you smack dab into that tension, and that's okay, because that's where Jesus lived. That's where he worked his gospel. I don't want to be a person, a Christian, a churchgoer who is known for being theologically correct, but devoid of the hands and feet love of Christ. But I dare not compromise what God said. I dare not compromise what God said, but I don't think we have to. I'm going to ask the band to come up now. And just before we launch, or just before we go out for the weekend, to your Thanksgiving gathering, wherever you're going, I'd like you to bow with me for prayer. Heavenly Father, I thank you so much that you sent your son Jesus to model this stuff, to teach this stuff. Because this is hard. This is so hard. And I feel this tension in me, and I feel this tension on behalf of everybody who's here and who's listening to this and who actually plans on living this out. I feel that tension, that wrestling that's going to come. God, right now I ask that you would flood the people here today with your wisdom and power in equal measure. Lord, as the people are praying, even just 5 or 6 minutes today, God, I ask that you would speak to them in that 5 or 6 minutes. You would guide their heart. You'd soften their heart so they can receive your words. And guide them as they read the Bible so that they would not become self-righteous. Lord, I apologize and ask for forgiveness for myself and on behalf of everybody here for the self-righteousness that has crept into the church, for the self-righteousness that somehow, because you saved us, that we're better than other people, that we're more clean, God, that we're too high and mighty to be in the trenches and in the mud and in the dirt with the rest of people. And God, I ask for forgiveness and I ask that you would break the back of that self-righteous spirit right now, God, in your name. At the same time, God, I refuse to back down from your words that are written in this book. They're spoken in my heart. God, I ask that if anything, you'd make them more real to me, not as abstract concepts to be debated and argued and talked about, but as real instructions for how to live with a muddy world. God, I pray. God, I ask for strength as I walk and as we all walk through that tension, God. Lord, I pray that you bring us together in groups, maybe they official small groups or just unofficial meetings. It doesn't really matter, God, that you'd bring us together so we can encourage and support and hold each other accountable. Because this is too big on our own. I know that, God. It's too big on our own. Lord, and as we act these things out, as we do that living out of your faith, your hands and feet and works, God, I pray you would help us to balance our works so that people wouldn't see them as condescending, but as loving, as care, as compassion. Open doors for us, God, that we can walk through. I pray all this in your precious and holy name. Amen.